When you hear the name Queen Brunhilda, what comes to mind? For centuries, history has painted her as a villain, a cruel, ruthless, and evil queen. Medieval chronicles are filled with tales of her supposed monstrosity, portraying her as a monster who got what she deserved. But history, as we know, is never black and white. The truth is far more complex and, frankly, far more interesting. Behind these sensational stories stands a formidable woman who wielded immense power in a brutal, male-dominated world. She was a queen, a regent, and a political player who navigated the treacherous courts of the Franks for over 4 decades. But her ambition and her refusal to step aside ultimately led to one of the most gruesome and infamous executions in history. This wasn't just about killing a queen. It was about erasing her from history, humiliating her, and turning her life into a cautionary tale. This is the dark and shocking story of how Queen Brunhilda really did end, why her end was designed to be far worse than death itself. To understand Brunhilda's tragic end, we first need to go back to the beginning. Born around the year 543, Brunhilda was a Visigothic princess from Spain. She was known for her intelligence, her education, and her striking beauty. In 567, she married Sigebert I, the king of a Frankish kingdom called Austria. This was a major political alliance, but it was also the start of a lifelong, bloody family feud. You see, the Frankish kingdoms were a messy patchwork of territories ruled by brothers who were constantly at war with each other. Sigebert's main rival was his own half-brother Chilperic, the king of Neustria. Things got even more complicated when Chilperic married Brunhilda's own sister, Galswintha. But just a year later, Galswintha was found strung-led in her bed, and Chilperic quickly married his mistress, a former servant named Fredegund. Brunhilda was devastated and enraged. She demanded justice for her sister's murder, and this ignited a war that would last for decades, pitting Brunhilda against Fredegund in a bitter rivalry that became the stuff of legend. Both women were fiercely protective of their children and their power, and they stopped at nothing to secure their family's legacy. Throughout this conflict, Brunhilda proved herself to be a brilliant political strategist. When her husband Sigebert was assassinated in 575, likely on Fredegund's orders, Brunhilda was captured and imprisoned. But she didn't just give up. She managed to escape and became the regent for her young son, Chilbert II. This was highly unusual for the time. Women were not supposed to rule, but Brunhilda held on to power with an iron grip. For the next several decades, she was the true power behind the throne, first for her son, and then for her grandsons. She was a skilled administrator, reforming taxes, building churches, and repairing old Roman roads. She corresponded with the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor, proving she was a major player on the European stage. She was, for all intents and purposes, the ruler of Austrasia and later Burgundy as well. But her success came at a cost. To maintain her power, she had to be ruthless. The Frankish nobility resented her authority. They saw her as a foreign woman who had overstepped her bounds. They constantly plotted against her, and she, in turn, had to eliminate her rivals to survive. This earned her a reputation for cruelty. Her enemies, especially those who wrote the histories later, made sure to paint her as a tyrannical monster. Her longtime rival Fredegund eventually died of natural causes, a peaceful end that Brunhilda would be denied. Fredegund's son, Clothar II, inherited her ambition and her deep-seated hatred for Brunhilda and her family line. He saw Brunhilda as the ultimate obstacle to his goal of uniting all the Frankish kingdoms under his rule. As Brunhilda grew older, her power began to wane. Her grandsons, whom she had placed on the thrones of Austrasia and Burgundy, grew to resent her control and tried to push her out. But Brunhilda was a survivor. She outlived her son and both of her grandsons, who died young. In 613, at nearly 70 years old, she was once again regent, this time for her great-grandson, Sigebert II. This was the last straw for the Austrasian and Burgundian nobles. They were tired of being ruled by an old woman, led by powerful figures like Pepin of Landen and Arnulf of Metz, ancestors of the future Carolingian dynasty. They decided to betray her. They made a secret deal with their enemy, Clothar II. They promised to hand over the young king and Brunhilda in exchange for keeping their own power and influence. When Chlothair's army advanced, Brunhilda's forces simply melted away. The nobles had opened the gates. The queen regent and her great-grandson were captured without a fight. The young Sigebert II and his brother were immediately executed, wiping out Brunhilda's a direct line. But for Brunhilda, Clothair had something far more terrible in mind. He didn't just want her dead. He wanted to make an example of her. He wanted to destroy her reputation and legacy forever. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Clothair put Brunhilda on trial. He accused her of the deaths of 10 Frankish kings. Now, this was a wildly exaggerated charge. While Brunhilda was certainly involved in political intrigue and likely had blood on her hands, accusing her of 10 royal murders was pure propaganda, designed to justify what he was about to do. According to the chronicles, Clothair subjected the elderly queen to 3 days of torture. For 3 days, the woman who had ruled kingdoms and corresponded with emperors was subjected to unimaginable pain and humiliation in front of the entire army. This public degradation was a crucial part of the punishment. It was meant to strip her of her royal dignity, to show everyone that her power was gone, and that this is what happens to women who dare to rule like men. After 3 days of torment, the final act of this gruesome spectacle began. They brought out a camelon animal meant to be both exotic and ridiculous and paraded the broken queen on its back through the military camp. This was an act of mockery, reducing the once mighty regent to a circus freak. It was a symbolic gesture to show how far she had fallen. And then came the end. The final, brutal execution was designed for maximum horror and symbolism. The soldiers tied Brunhilda by her hair, one arm and one leg to the tail of a wild, untamed horse. The horse was then whipped into a frenzy. It galloped off, dragging the queen's body behind it. She was trampled and torn apart by the horse's hooves. Her body dashed against the rocks and earth until there was almost nothing left. This method of execution, being torn apart by a horse, was particularly significant. It was a punishment that symbolically mirrored the division of the kingdom she had fought so hard to control. Her body was literally ripped apart, just as the Frankish lands had been torn apart by civil war for decades. It was a brutal, visual metaphor for the chaos her enemies blamed her for. After a death, what little remained of a body was gathered up and burned on a pyre. There would be no royal tomb, no monument, no honorable burial. Clothair wanted to erase her from the physical world as completely as he was trying to erase her from history. The story of Brunhilda's death was then written down by her enemies. The most famous account comes from the Chronicle of Fredegar, a text written a generation later in the Kingdom of Burgundy, under the patronage of Clothair's successors. This chronicle cemented the image of Brunhilda as a monstrous villain, and her execution as a just and fitting end. It became the official version of history, a powerful piece of propaganda that shaped her reputation for over 1,000 years. So why was her death worse than death itself? Because it wasn't just about ending her life. It was a carefully orchestrated act of character assassination. The torture, the public humiliation on the camel, and the horrific execution were all designed to destroy her legacy. Clothair and the nobles who betrayed her needed to justify their actions. They couldn't just say they overthrew a powerful and effective, but inconvenient, female ruler. Instead, they had to turn her into a monster. By making her death so spectacularly gruesome, they created a powerful story that would be told for generations. A story that warned other women against seeking power. A story that said, this is what happens when you step out of your place. Her death became a tool to enforce patriarchal control and to legitimize the new ruling dynasty that was rising to power. For centuries, this propaganda worked. Brunhilda was remembered not as the skilled ruler she was, but as the evil queen who was torn apart by a horse. It is only in more recent times that historians have started to look past the hostile chronicles and reevaluate her life. By examining letters, laws, and other sources, a different picture emerges. A picture of a resilient, intelligent, and ambitious leader who fought for her family and her power in an incredibly violent and unstable world. Her story is a chilling reminder of how history is often written by the victors. The stories we are told are not always the truth. They are often the versions that best serve to the people in power. Queen Brunhilda paid the ultimate price, not just with her life, but with her very legacy. Her gruesome end was the final, brutal act in a long campaign to silence one of history's most powerful women. Ever wondered what Europe was like after the fall of Rome? It wasn't a peaceful transition. Imagine a world where order has collapsed, where new powers rise from the ashes, and survival depends on strength, cunning, and often betrayal. This was the landscape of the 6th and 7th centuries. The once mighty Roman Empire was a memory, and in its place, a chaotic patchwork of new kingdoms fought for dominance. Among these rising powers, one name stood out. The Franks. They were a Germanic people who carved out a massive kingdom, covering much of modern-day France and Germany. And at the heart of this kingdom was a dynasty so notorious, so steeped in violence and ambition, that their story reads more like a grim fantasy epic than a history textbook. This was the age of the Merovingians. The Merovingian kings, legendary descendants of the warrior Merovic, were known for their long hair, which they believed held their power and fortune. But their legacy isn't just about flowing locks and mystical origins. It's a story of brutal power struggles, where the crown was rarely passed down peacefully. Power was something you took, you fought for, and you killed for. Inheritance was no guarantee of safety. In fact, it often put a target on your back. To understand this era, we need to dive into the lives of the figures who defined it. Men and women whose ambitions shaped the future of Europe. Let's start with one of the most famous, or perhaps infamous, of them all. Clovis I. He wasn't just a king. He was the architect of the Frankish kingdom. Coming to power as a teenager, Clovis was a brilliant, ruthless military commander. He united the disparate Frankish tribes under his rule, not through diplomacy, but through the sharp edge of his sword. One of the most famous stories about Clovis involves the vase of sword. After a battle, a bishop begged for the return of a beautiful sacred vase that had been looted. Clovis agreed. But when the spoils were being divided, one of his soldiers, angry that the king was bending the rules, shattered the vase with his axe. Clovis said nothing at the time. A year later, during a military review, he recognized the soldier. He criticized the man's poorly kept weapons, and as the soldier bent down to pick up a weapon Clovis had thrown to the ground, the king split his skull with his own axe, saying, "Thus you did too, the Vasedzoitans." This story tells you everything you need to know about the concept of justice and power. Absolute, personal, and lethal. Clovis's reign was also marked by a pivotal decision. His conversion to Catholic Christianity. His wife, Clotilde, a Burgundian princess, was a devout Catholic and had long urged him to convert. Initially, Clovis was hesitant, but during a desperate battle against the Alemanni, with his army on the brink of collapse, he prayed to Clotilde's God, promising to be baptized if he won. The tide of the battle turned, and Clovis was victorious. He kept his word. This wasn't just a personal act of faith. It was a masterful political move. By embracing Catholicism, Clovis gained the support of the Gallo-Roman population and the powerful church, cementing his rule and laying the foundation for a unified Christian kingdom in the heart of Europe. But if Clovis built the kingdom, his descendants seemed determined to tear it apart. After his death, a Frankish tradition kicked in that would cause centuries of chaos. The kingdom wasn't passed to a single heir. It was divided equally among all the king's sons. Imagine a vast and powerful empire suddenly being split into 4 smaller, competing realms. This is exactly what happened. Clovis's 4 sons, Theuderic, Clodomir, Chilbert, and Clothar, each inherited a piece of the pie, and they weren't content to just rule their own portion. They immediately began plotting against each other. This generation set the stage for a cycle of civil war that would define the Merovingian era. Brothers fought brothers, uncles fought nephews, and the Frankish lands were soaked in royal blood. The story of Clodomir's sons is a particularly chilling example. After Clodomir was killed in battle, his 2 young sons were left in the care of their grandmother, but their uncles, Chilbert and Clothar, saw the boys not as family, but as rivals. They sent a messenger to Clotilde with a pair of scissors and a sword, offering her a grim choice. Either the boys would have their long hair cut, symbolically stripping them of their royal status and forcing them into a monastery, or they would be killed. The heartbroken Clotilde, in her grief, declared she would rather see them dead than and so Clothar took a dagger and murdered his own nephews with his bare hands. One managed to escape, but the message was clear. In the Merovingian world, family ties were no protection against ambition. Clothar eventually outlived or outmaneuvered all his brothers, briefly reuniting the Frankish kingdom under his sole rule. But when he died, the cycle began anew. The kingdom was once again divided, this time among his 4 sons. and this next generation would produce two of the most formidable and terrifying figures of the entire dynasty. Two queens who would wage a personal war against each other for decades. Their names were Brunhilda and Fredegond. Brunhilda was a Visigothic princess, renowned for her education, intelligence, and beauty. She married Sigebert, the king of Austrasia, one of the eastern Frankish kingdoms. Her sister, Galswintha, married Sigebert's brother, Chilperic, king of Neustria, the western kingdom. It was meant to be a pact of peace. But Chilperic already had a mistress, a former servant named Fredegond, who was cunning, ruthless, and pathologically ambitious. Fredegond was not about to be cast aside for a foreign princess. Soon after the marriage, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed, and just days later, Chilperic married Fredegond, making her queen. Brunhilda was enraged. Her sister had been murdered, and she was determined to have her revenge. This ignited a feud between the two queens and their respective kingdoms that would last for over 40 years. It was a war fought not just on the battlefield, but in the shadows, with assassins and poison. Fredegond was a master of intrigue. She dispatched assassins to kill her enemies, including her husband's own sons from a previous marriage, to clear the way for her own son, Clotho II, to inherit the throne. She even had a bishop stabbed to death during Mass. Brunhilda was just as formidable. She outlived her husband, her son, and her grandson, ruling as regent for each of them with an iron will. She was a brilliant administrator and politician, repairing Roman roads, building churches, and reforming the kingdom's finances. But her enemies painted her as a monster, a cruel tyrann. The long and bloody war between these two queens bled the Frankish kingdoms dry. The final act of this epic tragedy was brutal. After Fredegond died of natural causes, her son, Clotho II, eventually captured the elderly Brunhilda, now in her 70s. He accused her of the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, a convenient charge to justify his actions. He had her tortured for 3 days. Then, in a final act of humiliation and cruelty, he had her tied by her hair, one arm, and one leg to the tail of a wild horse. The horse was set loose, and the great Queen Brunhilda was torn to pieces before the horrified eyes of the army. This level of violence eventually took its toll on the dynasty. The constant civil wars weakened the kings, more and more. They relied on their chief officials, the mayors of the palace, to run the kingdoms. These mayors were the power behind the throne, while the Merovingian kings, who became known as the Dunathan kings, grew weaker and more ceremonial. The mayors of the palace commanded the armies, controlled the treasury, and made the real decisions. One family of mayors, in particular, grew incredibly powerful. The Pippinids, who would later be known as the Carolingians. Figures like Pepin of Herstyle and his son, Charles Martel, became the de facto rulers of the Franks. It was Charles Martel, the Hammer, who famously led the Frankish army to victory against the invading Umayyad Caliphate at the Battle of Tours. In 732, a victory often credited with saving Christian Europe. The Merovingian kings were still on the throne, but they were puppets. The end came in 751. The current mayor of the palace, Pepin, the short son of Charles Martel, decided he was done with the pretense. He sent a letter to the Pope, asking a simple but revolutionary question. Who should be king? The one who has the title, or the one who has the power? The Pope, needing a strong ally, sided with Pepin. And so, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed. His long royal hair was cut, and he was sent to a monastery to live out his days in obscurity. The dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years through fire and blood ended with a quiet shearing. Pepin the Short was crowned king of the Franks, beginning a new era and a new dynasty, the Carolingians. His son would become the most famous ruler of the Middle Ages, Charlemagne. The story of the Merovingians is a dark but fascinating chapter in European history. It's a raw, unfiltered look at the nature of power in a violent age. It shows how a dynasty, born from conquest, can ultimately consume itself through ambition and internal strife, paving the way for a new order to rise from its ashes. Their world of feuding queens, murdered princes, and shadowy mayors is a stark reminder that the foundations of modern Europe were built not just with stone and faith, but with blood and betrayal. Integrand often brutal theater of the 6th century. One woman's name echoes through the halls of history, a testament to ambition, tragedy, and sheer will. This is the story of Brunhilda, a Visigothic princess who became a Frankish queen, a ruler whose life was a relentless chess game played for the highest stakes, survival and power. Our story begins not with a fairy tale romance, but with a calculated political move. Brunhilda, the daughter of the Visigothic king in Spain, was renowned for her beauty, intelligence, and education. These qualities caught the eye of King Sigebert, I of Austrasia, one of the 4 grandsons of the legendary Clovis, who had carved the once mighty Frankish kingdom into warring territories. Sigebert's brother, Chilperic of Neustria, had married Brunhilda's own sister, Gals. But Chilperic was a man of fickle affections, dominated by his low-born mistress, Fredegund. In a shocking act of betrayal, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed, and Chilperic promptly married Fredegund. This brutal murder ignited a blood feud that would span decades and consume generations. In this volatile climate, Sigebert sought a more respectable and powerful alliance. He sent an embassy to Spain, requesting Brunhilda's hand. Her marriage to Sigebert in 567 was a grand affair, a beacon of hope for stability. Brunhilda, in a significant gesture, converted from Arian Christianity to the Catholic faith of her new kingdom. She wasn't just a bride, she was a diplomat, a unifier. The early years of her marriage seemed promising. She became Sigebert's trusted advisor, her sharp mind a valuable asset in the treacherous world of Merovingian politics. She bore him 3 children, Ingund, Clodosund, and a son, the future King Chilbert II. But the shadow of her sister's murder loomed large. Fueled by Brunhilda's grief and a thirst for justice, Sigebert launched a series of successful wars against his brother Chilperic. He was on the brink of total victory, having cornered Chilperic in the city of Tournai. The Neustrian nobles were ready to abandon their king and acclaim Sigebert as their own. It seemed that vengeance and unification were finally within reach. But power without protection is deadly. As Sigebert stood at the pinnacle of his success, poised to unite the fractured kingdoms, disaster struck. In the year 575, as he was being raised on the shields by his new subjects, a symbol of his acclamation as king, 2 assassins crept through the celebrating crowd. He died on the spot, his victory turning to ash in an instant. Brunhilda's world shattered. In a single moment, she went from being the wife of a triumphant king to a vulnerable widow in a hostile land. Her husband was dead, her army in disarray, and her sworn enemies, Chilperic and Fredegund, were resurgent. She was immediately captured and imprisoned in Rouen. Separated from her young children, her treasure was seized, and her future looked bleak. All the power she had wielded as queen was gone, evaporated with her husband's last breath. This, however, was not the end of Brunhilda's story. It was the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter. This was the moment a queen became a survivor, a politician, and a warrior in her own right. Locked away, she was underestimated. But Brunhilda possessed a formidable intellect and an unbreakable will. From her prison in Rouen, a surprising twist of fate occurred. Merovic, the son of her enemy Chilperic, came to visit her. Captivated by her beauty and perhaps seeing a political opportunity, he defied his father and married Brunhilda. This marriage was scandalous and ultimately doomed. Chilperic, furious at his son's betrayal, had the Marisa annulled and hunted Merovic down. But the union, however brief, had served its purpose. It had given Brunhilda an escape. She fled, embarking on a perilous journey back to Austrasia. There, she found her 5-year-old son, Chilbert II, had been placed on the throne by loyal Austrasian nobles. But a child king needs a regent, someone to rule in his name. The powerful lords of the kingdom had no intention of letting a foreign-born woman hold the reins of power. They saw her as a rival, a threat to their own influence. So began Brunhilda's long and arduous struggle. For the next several decades, she would fight tooth and nail to secure her son's throne and her own authority as regent. She wasn't fighting on a battlefield with a sword, but in the treacherous courts with wit, diplomacy, and ruthless determination. She formed alliances, outmaneuvered conspiracies, and purged her court of those who opposed her. She proved to be a remarkably skilled administrator. She repaired old Roman roads, reformed the kingdom's finances, reorganized the army, and built numerous churches and abbeys, cementing her image as a pious and effective ruler. Her greatest adversary remained Fredegund, the Queen of New. Their rivalry was the stuff of legend, a deeply personal and political war fought through assassinations, betrayals, and proxy conflicts. When Chilperic was himself assassinated in 584, leaving Fredegund as regent for her own infant son, Clotaire II, the stage was set for a battle of two queen regents. It was a struggle that would define an era, a bitter feud between two brilliant, power-hungry women who would stop at nothing to protect their children and their legacy. Brunhilda ruled Austrasia through her son, Chilbert II, and later through her grandsons, Ludebert II and Luderic II. When Chilbert died, she guided state policy, commanded armies through her generals, and navigated complex diplomatic relationships with the Byzantine Empire and the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. She was, in every sense, the true ruler, but her authoritarian style and her preference for centralized power, modeled on the Roman Empire she so admired, created powerful enemies among the Frankish nobility. They resented her control, her foreign birth, and her sheer competence. They saw her as a tyrant, a woman who had usurped the power that was rightfully theirs. As she grew older, her grip on power began to slip. Her own grandsons, incited by the jealous aristocracy, turned against her. They drove her from court, forcing her into exile. Yet Eventon, she did not give up. She found refuge in the smaller kingdom of Burgundy and continued to scheme to plan her return. The final act of Brunhilda's long and turbulent life was one of profound tragedy. After decades of war, Fredegund's son, Clotaire II, finally gained the upper hand. The Austrasian and Burgundian nobles, long tired of Brunhilda's rule, betrayed her. They handed the now elderly queen, in her 70s, over to her lifelong enemy. Clotaire II, channeling all the hatred his mother Fredegund had held for Brunhilda, subjected her to an execution of unimaginable cruelty. He accused her of the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, a ludicrous charge, but one that served his purpose. For 3 days, she was tortured. Then, in a final, horrifying spectacle, she was tied by her hair, one arm to her death, her body torn to pieces before the assembled army. It was a brutal end for a woman who had dominated the political landscape for nearly half a century. Her enemies sought to erase her from history, to portray her as a monstrous villain, a wicked queen of myth, and for a time, they succeeded. Later chroniclers, influenced by the victorious Neustrian faction, painted her as a figure of pure evil. But today, we can look back and see a more complex picture. Brunhilda was a product of her violent times. She was a woman who, stripped of her husband and her protection, refused to be a victim. She used every tool at her disposal: her intelligence, her royal blood, her political acumen to fight for her family and her kingdom. She was a builder, a reformer, and a diplomat. She was also ruthless, ambitious, and unforgiving. She was a queen who ruled like a king in an age that had no place for such a woman. Brunhilda's story is a stark reminder that in the unforgiving world of power politics, strength, intelligence, and even royal authority are not enough. After King Sigebert's assassination, she learned the hardest lesson of all. Power without loyal protection is a tightrope walk over a chasm. For over 40 years, she walked that rope with extraordinary skill. But in the end, when her last allies turned against her, she fell. Her life, a saga of triumph and tragedy, remains one of history's most compelling and cautionary tales. Ever wondered what happens to a queen after her king dies? In many stories, she fades into the background, a grieving widow, a footnote in history. But not Brunhilda of Austrasia. After her husband, King Sigebert, was assassinated, Brunhilda didn't just mourn. She stepped up. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the explosive beginning of her second act. Imagine the scene: a kingdom in chaos, a murdered king, and a court full of ambitious, ruthless men, all circling like vultures, ready to tear the realm apart for their own gain. They expected the foreign-born Visigothic princess to crumble, to flee, to be a pawn in their game. They couldn't have been more wrong. Brunhilda had a son, Childebert II, who was just a boy. To the Frankish nobles, a child king was the perfect opportunity. They could rule through him, sideline the queen mother, and carve up power for themselves. But Brunhilda was a political force of nature. She declared herself regent, the rightful guardian of her son and his kingdom. This was a bold, almost unprecedented move for a woman in the 6th century. She wasn't just a mother. She was the power behind the throne, and she made sure everyone knew it. Her first challenge was survival. The nobles who had plotted against her husband were still at large. They saw her as the main obstacle to their ambitions. But Brunhilda was a master strategist. She forged alliances, played her enemies against each other, and used every tool at her disposal: diplomacy, royal authority, and sheer force of will to secure her son's throne. She wasn't just reacting, she was on the offensive. One of her greatest rivals was her own sister-in-law Fredegund, the queen of the neighboring Frankish kingdom of Neustria. Their feud is the stuff of legend, a decades-long struggle that defined an era. Fredegund was implicated in Sigebert's murder, and for Brunhilda, this was not just politics, it was personal. It was a blood feud, a battle for the future of the entire Frankish realm. While Fredegund was infamous for her ruthlessness and assassinations, Brunhilda fought on a different battlefield. She focused on governance, on building a stable and prosperous kingdom for her son. As regent, Brunhilda proved to be an incredibly effective ruler. She wasn't just keeping the seat warm. She actively governed. Drawing on her educated Roman upbringing, she worked to centralize power, reform the tax system, and repair old Roman roads and infrastructure. She corresponded with the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor, positioning Austrasia as a major player on the European stage. She was building a legacy, a strong kingdom that could stand on its own. But for the Frankish aristocracy, a strong, centralized monarchy ruled by a competent woman was their worst nightmare. Their power depended on a weak king and a fragmented kingdom. They saw Brunhilda's reforms not as progress, but as a direct attack on their traditional rights and privileges. Every road she repaired, every tax she collected, every law she enforced was seen as an act of tyranny. They started to whisper. They started to plot. When her son Childebert came of age, Brunhilda didn't just retire. She transitioned into the role of a senior advisor, her influence as strong as ever. Together, they ruled, a formidable mother-son duo. They even managed to inherit the neighboring kingdom of Burgundy, expanding their power significantly. It seemed like Brunhilda's vision was finally coming to fruition. But tragedy struck again. Childebert died young, in his mid-20s, leaving behind 2 young sons of his own, Childebert and Dud. Once again, the kingdom was left with child rulers. And once again, Brunhilda stepped into the breach. Now a grandmother, she became regent for her grandsons, dividing the vast kingdom between them. This is where her story takes an even more dramatic turn. Being regent for her son was one thing. Being regent for her grandsons, this was unheard of. She was now a woman in her 60s, holding on to power for a 3rd generation. The nobles' resentment, which had been simmering for years, began to boil over. They saw an old woman clinging to power that they believed was rightfully theirs. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. The very qualities that made her a successful ruler, her intelligence, her political savvy, her ambition, were twisted and used against her. Chroniclers, often writing under the patronage of her enemies, began to paint a monstrous picture of Brunhilda. She wasn't a skilled stateswoman. She was a cruel, power-hungry tyrant. She wasn't a devoted mother and grandmother securing her family's legacy. She was a seductress, a witch who used dark arts to control her grandsons. The division of the kingdom between her 2 grandsons also created new tensions. Sibling rivalry was expertly manipulated by the nobles who surrounded them. They poisoned the young king's minds against each other and, more importantly, against their powerful grandmother. Childebert, the older brother, eventually turned on Brunhilda and exiled her from his court. Think about that for a moment. After dedicating her entire life to protecting her family and her kingdom, she was cast out by her own grandson. But Brunhilda was a survivor. She sought refuge at the court of her other grandson, Theuderic, who initially welcomed her. Together, they went to war against Theudebert. The family was now tearing itself apart, just as the nobles had always wanted. After a series of bloody battles, Theuderic defeated and executed his brother. For a brief moment, the kingdom was reunited. Brunhilda, now in her 70s, stood once more as the most powerful figure in the Frankish world, regent for the victorious Dudery. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable comeback, but it was to be short-lived. Just as they secured their victory, Dudoric died suddenly of dysentery. The kingdom was now supposed to pass to his infant son, Sigebert II, Brunhilda's great-grandson. Can you believe it? She was now poised to be regent for a fourth generation. For the aristocracy, this was the final straw. This old woman, this seemingly immortal queen, would outlast them all. They had to get rid of her for good. The leader of the noble conspiracy was a man named Warnakar. He and his allies knew they couldn't defeat Brunhilda on their own, so they made a deal with the devil. They reached out to Clota II, the king of Neustria, the son of Brunhilda's lifelong enemy, Fredegon. They promised to betray Brunhilda and her young great-grandson, and hand the entire kingdom over to him in exchange for preserving their own power and privileges. The trap was set. When Clota's army marched into Austrasia, Brunhilda's own forces, led by the treacherous nobles, abandoned her. She was captured while trying to flee. The end had come. Clotar, finally avenging his mother Fredegond, subjected Brunhilda to a show trial. He accused her of the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, a ludicrous charge that compiled every rumor and piece of slander that had been hurled at her for decades. For 3 days, the elderly queen, now nearly 80 years old, was publicly tortured. Her end was brutal, designed to be the ultimate humiliation. According to the chronicles, she was tied by one arm, one leg, and her hair to the tail of a wild horse, which was then set loose. She was torn apart. It was a horrific death, a terrifying spectacle meant to erase not just her life, but her legacy, and to serve as a warning to any woman who dared to wield power like a man. For centuries, that's how she was remembered, as the villain of the story, the evil queen of Dark Age saga. But today, historians are re-examining her life. They're looking past the biased chronicles written by her enemies and seeing the powerful, effective, and astonishingly resilient ruler she truly was. She was a woman who governed for over 40 years in a world that did everything it could to stop her. Brunhilda's story is a stark reminder of how history is often written by the victors, and how Izali, a powerful woman, can be demonized. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories. See you next time.